Hello dear students, welcome to another lecture on utilitarianism. Today we will be learning about James Mill and his contributions to the idea of utilitarianism. The main objectives of the lecture are to study the historical concept of utilitarianism, to understand James Mill's contributions to freedom, to know the concept of representative democracy. By the end of the lecture, you will be able to understand the meaning of utilitarianism, Mill's contribution to the ideas of liberty, political representation, freedom of press and participative democracy. Dear students, to begin with, James Mill is considered by many as one of the early stalwarts of the modern utilitarian tradition of social and political philosophy. He is a Scottish historian, economist and political theorist. He made significant contributions to several fields including political philosophy, psychology, economics, jurisprudence and even educational theory. James Mill shared with his intellectual collaborator and mentor Jeremy Bentham a firm belief that utility should be the organizing principle of societal institutions. He wanted to reform society in a rational manner with utility as the guiding principle. Being a multifaceted person, James Mill even took a keen interest in history and published the book The History of British India in 1818, which continues to be an influential work on Indian history. As a matter of fact, James Mill is generally held as the earliest historian to categorize Indian history into popular Hindu, Muslim and British time periods framework. This continues to be a significant framework in Indian historical studies, despite facing several criticisms. James Mill took great interest in the colonial administration of India and he justified British imperialism across the world in the name of rational utility. He believed in the philosophical theories of French Revolution on rights and absolute equality. In the modern philosophy of the 19th century, he was said to be the founder of philosophical radicalism. Apart from these writings, his significant works are Commerce Defended in 1808, Thomas Smith on Money and Exchange, Elements of Political Economy in 1821, Essays on Government, Jurisprudence, Liberty of the Press, Education and Prisons and Prison Discipline in 1823, Analysis of the Phenomena of the Human Mind in 1829 and The Principles of Toleration. Like many Western philosophers of the Enlightenment period, James Mill also justified European colonialism in the name of rationality, which was in reality a self-serving thesis. That aside, it is worth noting that James Mill's ideas contributed significantly to the Ricardian school of economics. Thus, James Mill was undoubtedly a prolific philosopher with varied contributions. Yet, there is no consensus about whether his works should figure in the canon of Western philosophy. This is partly because James Mill is often overshadowed by his more illustrious mentor Jeremy Bentham and also by his famous son J.S. Mill. As a result of being in the shadows cast by Bentham and J.S. Mill, James Mill's own contributions are often ignored and underappreciated. James Mill is seen predominantly by many as either Bentham's collaborator or as J.S. Mill's father. In such a context, it is important to give James Mill his due and study his ideas and perspectives, as they offer some remarkable insights. So, in this lecture, let us examine some of the key ideas of James Mill in detail. Let us begin by discussing the historical and socio-political context of James Mill, which greatly influenced his ideas and perspectives. James Mill was born in 1773 in Scotland in a family of modest means. He was therefore about 25 years junior to Jeremy Bentham, who would eventually have a great influence on him. Mill's disciplinarian mother trained him to focus his energies on studies, and he excelled in education, thanks to the sharp mind and excellent work ethics. James Mill was truly a hard-working and disciplined individual. He would eventually go to the University of Edinburgh. As it was with Bentham, James Mill lived through a period of great social, political and economic transformation in Europe. Industrial and scientific revolutions were rapidly changing the socio-economic structures of Europe, and intellectual movements like the Enlightenment were infusing new ideas and philosophies. Old orthodoxies of all kinds were giving way to new beginnings. Revolutions and reforms were being advocated by many scholars and public intellectuals. Scotland especially was an important center of enlightenment. Scottish Enlightenment gave rise to key thinkers like Adam Smith, David Hume and several others, who greatly shaped the contours of enlightenment itself. Many of the important values of the Scottish Enlightenment greatly influenced James Mill's ideas. He met Jeremy Bentham around 1808, and their meeting led to a strong philosophical association between the two philosophers. They set up the journal Westminster Review in 1824, which advocated the philosophy of utilitarianism. Even though there were some differences between their perspectives, both saw utility as a general framework to organize society. James Mill's main work as a political theorist was Essay on Government, which was first published in 1820. This book sought to provide a framework and rationale for government based on his utilitarian commitments. James Mill died in 1836, just 4 years after Bentham. His works continue to have relevance and offer useful insights. Let us now move on to discuss some of the ideas of James Mill in detail. James Mill saw government as a tool, that is, a mere means for achieving the general end of happiness of the entire community. Like Bentham, James Mill also believed that every human being is driven by a desire to avoid or minimize pain and maximize pleasure. A person's pleasure or pain can come from two sources. Firstly, from other human beings, and secondly, from nature itself. Example, famine leading to starvation, that is, pain, or good rains leading to a rich harvest, that is, pleasure. A government must try to maximize the happiness of its subjects from both these sources. This is especially difficult when it comes to the other human beings. Thus, he writes the following about the government, and I quote, "Its business is to increase to the utmost the pleasures and diminish to the utmost the pains which men derive from one another," unquote. James Mill goes on to explain why this is difficult. He argues that labor leads to a person gaining more resources, thereby receiving more happiness. For example, someone works for 8 hours and receives a salary through which he or she can buy the things that make him or her happy. Thus, James wrote, and I quote, "Of the laws of nature on which the condition of man depends, that which is attended with the greatest number of consequences is the necessity of labor for obtaining the means of subsistence, as well as the means of the greatest part of our pleasure." Unquote. Yet, James Mill noted a paradox here. He argued that labor is painful and hence many people might want to avoid it. Hence, given a chance, many human beings will try to avoid the pain of labor by exploiting the other people's labor to gain happiness for free. This will lead to pain for those whose labor is being exploited, as the pleasure due to them is being denied to them. Hence, for James Mill, the main purpose of building a political system is to design it in such a manner that there is less exploitation of other people's labor. It is from this core principle James Mill derives his justifications for the right form of government. Thus, for James Mill, monarchy fails this test because therein the monarch with unlimited powers was bound to exploit the labor of his people in order to avoid the pain of laboring and to maximize his individual pleasure. For the same reason, James Mill also rejects aristocracy as being far from ideal, because in it the ruling elite will be exploiting the labor of the rest of the people to maximize their pleasures. James Mill therefore recognizes that the answer has to be democracy, and hence he wrote, and I quote, "Whenever the powers of government are placed in the hands other than those of the community, whether those of one man, of a few, or of several, those principles of human nature which imply that government is at all necessary, imply that those persons will make use of them to defeat the very end for which government exists." Unquote. Thus, James Mill was a great advocate of democratization, but he knew that democracy came in several forms, shapes and flavors. Especially during his time period, there was a vibrant debate between the proponents of direct democracy versus the supporters of representative democracy. In this context, James Mill does not advocate for a simple direct democracy. This is so because in a direct democracy, all the citizens have to be directly involved in ruling, and that would require investment of time and energy. This time and energy could otherwise have been invested in labor, leading to maximizing happiness for the entire community. For this reason, James Mill finds simple direct democracy unappealing. Therefore, James Mill's solution is to suggest a representative democracy where people elect representatives who rule on their behalf for a fixed period of time. James Mill does recognize the challenge of making the representatives rule for public interest rather than ruling in self-interest, as they might also be tempted to become corrupt. The representatives should not become a kind of ruling elite who rule in their own interest, exploiting the people to maximize their pleasures. However, James Mill believed that designing proper political institutions can greatly mitigate this threat. He believed that representatives could be held accountable to a great extent by having short terms in office for them and therefore frequent elections. This would keep them on their toes and make them not take their positions for granted. Mill argued that since the representatives came from the people and anticipated to go back to living among the people after the end of their political career, they would be more inclined to rule in the interest of the people. In this fashion, James Mill was a champion of representative form of democracy over other forms of government. James Mill also had pretty strong views about how political representation should be enacted in a state. To understand his viewpoint better, a little context about surrounding debates about political representation which were happening during his time period is essential. This was a period when democratization was slowly unfolding in many countries of Europe. However, the erstwhile feudal aristocracy of Europe were reluctant to yield power to the masses. They were trying to hold on as much power as possible. Yet, industrialization had led to the emergence of new aspirational social classes whose influence was growing exponentially. These classes wanted political equality and tend to see the erstwhile aristocracy as undeserving of the power they were wielding. The rise of liberal philosophy in the works of scholars like John Locke provided an added moral emphasis for ensuring political equality of all citizens. In such a context, philosophers like Rousseau were at one end of the spectrum and argued that citizens cannot be politically represented by others and therefore advocated a direct participatory democracy wherein citizens are fully engaged in governance. Rousseau believed that delegating legislative power to a small group of representatives is unacceptable in a truly democratic system. He saw such delegation as loss of freedom for the citizens. Rousseau thus advocated for a radical participatory democracy governed by general will of the people, which is ascertained based on active participation of all the citizens. On the other side, scholars sympathetic to the feudal elite and status quo were arguing for representation by the elite for the masses and were not even ready to offer universal franchise to all. Scholars like Edmund Burke belonged to this side of the debate. Some of them dubbed this notion as virtual representation, by which it was argued that people need not even vote to select representatives, as the noble elite can represent the interests of all. This was in reality a thinly veiled attempt to preserve the power and privileges of the elite by using convoluted arguments. Let us now move on to discuss political representation. In this scenario, James Mill took the middle course between radical participatory democrats and the supporters of the so-called virtual representation. In response to the arguments of the radical participatory democrats like Rousseau, James Mill argued that a properly designed representative system would be more efficient than a direct participatory system. James Mill declared such a representative system as a grand discovery of modern times, as it freed the common people from the onerous task of governance such that they can enjoy other liberties. This increased the overall utility of society as more citizens can be involved in productive activities of their choice. Thus, according to James Mill, a representative form of government allowed people to be more free and be more productive in comparison to a direct participatory democratic system. In response to the arguments by the supporters of virtual representation, James Mill argued that universal franchise is necessary to hold the government accountable. He argued that if the citizens did not even have a vote in the political process, then the entire political system is bound to become corrupt and captive to elite interests, as they would have a free rein. Therefore, he rejected any justifications for restrictions on voting or notions like virtual representation. James Mill, therefore, preferred as large a franchise as possible such that the government is truly representative. This was also influenced by Mill's individualistic perspective that the best judge of one's interests are individuals themselves, and therefore nobody else can properly represent an individual without hearing his or her voice. Elections provide the mechanism for providing a voice to all citizens. In this manner, James Mill argued for a proper representative government which was built on the foundations of the widest possible franchise. Moving ahead to freedom of press, James Mill was also a great advocate for the freedom of the press, and his views likely had a huge influence on his son J.S. Mill's views on liberty, who would later advocate for freedom with great passion and conviction. James Mill saw freedom of the press as an essential part of proper government. This is so because he considered free expression of opinions as an integral element of a free government, and therefore he was averse to censorship and restrictions on free speech. Moreover, he also argued that an enlightened and informed citizenry is critical for any society. James Mill saw free speech and freedom of press critical for that endeavor as well. Thus, he wrote, and I quote, "The government and the people are under a moral necessity of acting together. A free press compels them to bend to one another," unquote. Hence, it will not be wrong to say that much like his son J.S. Mill, James Mill also saw great societal and individual utility in freedom of expression. Further, being a critique of aristocratic trappings, himself coming from modest means, James Mill was a great advocate of merit over accidents of birth determining the success of the person. He saw education, hard work, intelligence as contributing to the merit of a person rather than birth or belonging to an exalted family line. He was therefore a champion of the rising educated sections of society and stood with them as opposed to the feudal aristocracy. Some have therefore labelled James Mill as a supporter of the middle class, but strictly speaking, his appreciation was for meritocratic people in society who might come from all classes. In conclusion, James Mill's ideas on government, representation, freedom and merit, among others, offer rich insights which are relevant even till today. However, his passionate justification of British colonialism and imperialism in India, which was driven by greed and violence, is a stain on his philosophical contributions. As noted earlier, this is just one another example of a general tendency among Western scholars of his period to rationalize and justify the violence and greed of European colonialism in benign terms. This was clearly self-serving, and James Mill falls into the same trap. Moreover, utilitarianism as a general principle has been criticized by many from a variety of perspectives. There are legitimate concerns about minority rights and individual rights in a utilitarian state. As such, a state can be majoritarian in its orientation. These and other criticisms of utilitarianism in general will apply to many of James Mill's ideas, and they need to be examined with care. These limitations aside, it is undeniable that James Mill's contributions to several fields are noteworthy and they deserve careful study. However, we must learn that utilitarianism generally focuses on outcomes and thus becomes a moral theory to determine what is right or wrong. Can we call it a form of consequentialism? The answer to this question must be yes. Utilitarians emphasize the greatest good for the greatest number, which becomes a basis for an ethical choice. Even in education, James Mill focuses on the valuable and practical aspects. The aim of education must be to teach the utility of the knowledge produced. In India, scientific and technical advances were simply the ways of life in the past. One could understand that in the Indian context, it was merely a gap between the utility and its formal knowledge. In contrast, after acknowledging the utility of the resources from the Western world, including knowledge creation, Indians started recognizing their own. However, in no case should Indian civilization be considered lower to the European culture, as propounded by Mill in his writing of the history. Instead, we must focus on the relevance of utilitarianism via practical philosophy in contemporary times. Does it aim to make society a better place? It remains the essential question within the application domain of what we possess. And in the case of non-possessions, still utility remains relevant. We must understand it in its wholesomeness of the socio-cultural, moral, historical, political, economic, scientific and educational structure. James Mill draws that scope through his various works and arguments, guiding us towards a more serviceable and promising society. Dear students, hope you got good inputs on James Mill. We'll meet again to discuss another thinker on utilitarianism. Thank you.